I want to start by giving you a big picture of the framework on which we're going to study competitive markets. So we're going to look at a simple model of a market at a time, not of the whole economy at once. And basically, we're going to look at a market, market for good X, or for commodity X in isolation, without worrying about what happens in other market. And then we're going to assume that the number of consumers is fixed. So 1 to capital C are the consumers. Think of consumer 1, consumer 2 up to consumer capital C, and 1 up to capital F are the firms with names firm 1, firm 2, firm capital F. And what happens is that all of these consumers, so the consumers and all of these firms are going to come and interact in a market, and that market is going to generate an outcome. And we're going to call a description of that outcome an allocation. And I will define it for you carefully in a second. Now let me emphasize a couple of important things. One is an assumption, which is that we're going to assume that who are the consumers are the firms is fixed. So fixed market participants. We are not going to assume in this simple model that new firms can come in and out or that consumers can come in and out. Of course, that happens in reality, but in our first pass on the study of the markets, we're going to ignore that, and we're going to look at what happens when a fixed number of consumers and a fixed number of firms come together and interact. The other one is just a simple piece of notation, which is I'm going to denote by WZ the wealth of consumer Z. That is the wealth, the amount of good M that they have when they come into the market before they trade. So this is the amount of good M that they have prior to trade. And we're going to assume that the wealth of the firms is 0. We're not going to have to track the wealth of firms because we're going to assume that is generally 0. This is a simplifying assumption. Everything can be simply generalized to that case, but I don't want to worry about this complication in this first course. So now we're ready to define an allocation. An allocation is basically intuitively a full description of the outcome, but more precisely is a list that gives answers to the following key question: who produces what and how, and who consumes what. Now, for detailing who produces what and how, what we need to do is for every firm, we need to give two quantities, this Q1F and this MF1. And we need to do, I will explain what they mean in a second, to do the same thing for every firm. Sorry, this is MFF. Let me describe what this means. This is the quantity of X, or amount of X produced by firm 1, amount of X produced by firm 1. This is the same thing for firm F. There's one for firm 2 and for every firm between. And this is the amount of good M used by firm 1. This is the same for firm F. Remember, these are the costs of production. And now we also need to specify the analogous for the consumer, which is how much do they consume. So this is for consumer 1, how much he consumes of X and of good 1, and we do it for every consumer. So just again to be precise, this is amount of X consumed by C equals 1, and this is the amount of good M consumed by consumer 1, and the same thing for every consumer. Now you may be thinking, what a nightmare of notation, and I'm with you, but it's unavoidable because we need to keep track of many things to really fully describe the outcome of a market. Remember, there are many players, there are two goods, there are firms and consumers. So just for your mnemonic device, whether this is F or C just refers whether we're talking about firms or consumers, that's superscript. The lower script just denotes the name of the person, of the firm or the consumer. Okay? And Q or M just denotes whether we're talking about the market for the good we're interested on, like Q, like the good X, or whether we're talking about this composite good M. Now, the previous list gives you a description of what is produced by each firm, how many costs do they use in production, and how much every individual consumes of goods X and M. The problem is that some of those allocations that you could specify may not be feasible. So we want to define something which is called a feasible allocation. Is one that can be achieved given the resource and technological constraints of the market. And in particular is one that satisfies the following properties. One is a feasibility constraint for the X good. And what is this saying? It says that the sum over all consumers of the amount that they consume, let me change this to I to make the notation clearer, has to be equal to the amount that all of the firms produce. And also, of course, all of the productions and consumption levels have to be non-negative. Now, just in case, to remind you, a handful of you don't remember this notation, just remember that this just means, I'm going to write it here, this is just equal to QF1 plus QF2 plus QFF. Okay? We are adding over all consumers and over all firms. Okay. So all that is telling you is that all of the amount that consumers consume is exactly what gets produced. There is no more, there is no less. So it's feasible in that sense. And the second thing, there has to be feasibility for the M good. What does that mean? It means that the sum, again, of our consumers, of what we give them of good I, has to be equal to whatever wealth. Sorry, let me actually write it slightly different. It's going to be more intuitive. Has to be plus the sum of our firms of whatever they used. Remember, this is where the cost of production has to be equal to whatever amount of this M good there was there in the first place. And not only that, the production has to be feasible. So MCJ has to be equal to the cost for firm J of producing QFJ for all firms J. Now this is a handful of notation, but it's actually quite intuitive. Let me explain. This is saying that all of the uses of good M, this is the amount that is given to consumers, this is the amount of good M used by firms in production, has to be exactly equal to the amount of good M that we have to start with. That is the resource constraint of the economy. The technologically constraint for the economy comes in the following sense. If each firm J wants to produce this much, these are the costs that it needs, given its technology. This CJ is the cost function. So this is the cost function of firm J. And therefore, this is how much they need to be able to produce that much. And that is another usage for good M that needs to be taken into account. So the bottom line here is that not every allocation is feasible. Only allocations that satisfy this constraint are feasible.